Welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar in our webinar series, Building Better Research, RCT Design and Implementation. Before I begin, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website and shared via email in the upcoming weeks. So by participating in the session, you are consenting to being recorded. I'm Raquel and I work as a Senior Policy Manager for JPAL Africa, and I'm joined today by Nilmini Herath. Nilmini is the former research lead at JPAL Africa and soon to be Assistant Professor in Economics at Trinity University in Dublin. Nilmini will be presenting on how to measure social networks and other complex outcomes that rely on respondent recall today. Please feel free to, at any point, add any questions you might have in the chat. We will monitor the chat and pause in the middle of the presentation for questions, and then again towards the end of the presentation. I would now like to hand over to Nilmini.
Thank you, Raquel. Let me just share my screen and then we can get this up and running. Sorry, all the Zoom stuff is in the way. Here we go. Okay, can everyone see the slides? Okay, wonderful. All right, well, yeah, thank you very much for having me, Raquel. It's lovely. It's an honor to be here talking to you today about doing surveys on social networks. This is an area that is extremely close to my heart, and I'm going to be presenting some insights from some experimental work, some general insights, and then some work from experimental evidence that we've created in partnership with JPAL. I have to shout out a few people before I start. One is Raquel, who's hosting us today. She designed a lot of the survey tool that I'm going to be talking to you about in her previous role when she worked on this study, and my co-author Patrizio Pereno at the University of Notre Dame, who's also collaborated on this with us, and also our wonderful funders of this research, so which includes JPAL's Jobs and Opportunities Initiative, the International Growth Centre, the IDRC, and the Agency Fund. Okay, so let me talk to you about doing surveys on social networks. I'm gonna first talk to you a little bit today about why we have to care so much about measuring things correctly with RCTs. And then I'm going to introduce some of the challenges we'll have in measuring social networks, but why we want to do it anyway, despite these challenges. And then I'll spend some time going into how we should measure social networks, what we're learning so far. I'm going to focus, so much of the talk is going to be focused on this third point. And within this, I'm going to be focused on how we measure something called ego networks. So this is just thinking about our respondents in our RCT surveys and trying to capture the set of people that they're turning to for support, to borrow from, to learn from, whatever kind of network you're trying to capture, and how to capture the characteristics of those people. I'll share with you some results of an RCT we did, trying to ask these questions in different ways and randomizing the way we do that. And I'll show you what we've learned about how we can overcome things like recall challenges and survey fatigue that can set in with when doing this kind of research. And as part of that, I'll do a short demo of some dedicated software we've been using called Network Canvas. One thing I won't do today is speak to you about how to take these surveys of individuals and construct a sort of entire network out of them. So thinking about, say, a whole village or a whole who's connected to whom in different firms. But I can point you to some resources where you can find out how to take that next step if that's something you want to do. The other thing I'm not going to talk about today is how to use administrative data on networks. So if you wanted to pull data from one of the big tech social networks like X or Facebook or something, or from mobile phone data, this is going to be more focused on how we do surveys on social networks. But again, some of the concepts might apply. Okay, so let me start with why we should care about measurement in RCTs. And here I'm speaking to you not only as a researcher who conducts RCTs myself, but as the former lead of the JPL Africa research vertical. I got to work with lots of different researchers on lots of different studies. I think I've worked on 30 RCTs so far. And I can see that sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, we can really get measurement wrong in ways that have important implications for the studies. And so I want to highlight some of what can go wrong here and why we need to care. So let me give you a scenario. Imagine that you have gone to all the effort of running an RCT to test the effectiveness of a program on labor markets. Maybe it's a work experience program, maybe it's a vocational training program, maybe it's a career counseling service, something that was trying to get people into good jobs. And maybe you're doing this in a context with lots of unemployment, so you're concerned about this. And you've gone to all the effort to run the study. You've written those funding applications, you've run your surveys, you've hired the team, you've hired the survey team, you've administered the treatment, you've worked with a partner, government or NGO to do this. And you've gone to all this enormous effort that it takes to run these kind of studies. You've done all this, and at the end of the study, you've got your treatment group and your control group, and you ask them one question in your endline survey. You probably ask more, but one of the key questions you ask is, do you have a job? Seems simple enough. It seems like a natural question to ask. We want to know how many people in the treatment group have jobs and how many people in the control group have jobs. And you ask this question and you find that 70% of people in both groups have jobs and only 30% don't. So you conclude that the program has no impact on employment. But maybe what you've done here is used too loose a definition of a job. Either, maybe the way your enumerators have interpreted this question or your respondents is they've considered any kind of job to be the kind of job you wanted to capture as a researcher. So that could include being a professor of economics at the University of Ghana, or that could include braiding hair on the side of the street, or buying a packet of cigarettes and selling them one by one. These are real jobs that people have in developing countries. There's a lot of kind of informal labor and self-employment, but not all of them are necessarily the kind of jobs that you would necessarily want to focus on as a researcher interested in this program. If you drilled down on this measure a little bit and asked people to specify a bit more about the nature of this job, you might be able to capture that actually of these 70% of people who were employed in both groups, in the treatment group, we have a lot more people in formal employment. So they have paperwork and contracts and rights and things. Whereas in the control group, we have a lot more of this informal self-employment that I've been discussing. If you had asked the same exact question, do you have a job in this way, but you had defined the job a bit more precisely, you would reach this different conclusion that the program increases formal employment by 30 percentage points. Same study, but different measures revealing different effects. And this doesn't mean that we always want to go necessarily more and more narrow or more defined in the way we do our measures. We might want to, if we took this too far and said, okay, well, we only care about really, really good jobs. So I only want to consider people who have permanent full-time employment. Then maybe that's something that's very rare in the context you're working in. And so only 10% of people in each group fulfill that criteria. And again, because we've used too narrow a definition of a job, we could again conclude that the program has no impact on employment, but it's because we defined employment very, very narrowly. So again, it's the same study, the same people, the same program, but because of the way we did that endline measurement, we got we can come to very different conclusions. We could have a definition of our key outcome variable that's too broad, that's too narrow, or hopefully we can find the one that's just right for us. Which ones are just right for us? That depends on what program you're evaluating, what it's trying to do, what you expect it to do. If it's a program that's supposed to get people into self-employment, maybe you need outcomes on that. If you're supposed to get people into formal salaried employment, then maybe you want to be asking specific questions on this. But you need to, take into account what your treatment's supposed to do, what your context is, um, what barriers you have in sort of what format you can ask the questions in, how long you can ask questions for, how many of these you can ask. And you might also have some to think about other factors like policy relevance. So I know this might sound very obvious, but I have watched over and over again very experienced researchers make this mistake in their endline surveys. And I think it's because at the time that your survey is going to field is usually quite a stressful time. Usually you've had to try and do a lot of heavy lifting to get to the point where you can run an endline survey. You maybe have had to raise a lot of research funding, organize things with your partners around accessing the participants, hiring teams of people who can run your fieldwork operations for you and do the data collection. It's often quite a stressful time, and it's not necessarily the time we're sitting there obsessing about what definition of a job are we using, or whatever the measure is for you. But it's really important to get these measures sort of just right, and not go too broad or too narrow. Now, there's a lot more to say on measurement. I've given you one specific example of, what might happen if we mismeasure our Y variable. Other things might happen if we mismeasure X variables or sources of heterogeneity. And so I'll point you here to JPAL's got some wonderful research resources, including dedicated sections on measurement. But I'll now turn my focus to the idea of measuring social networks. So let me start with just trying to understand why we should try and measure something as complex as a social network. I've already illustrated to you that measuring even something very simple, like whether or not you have a job, already has some complexity to it. So why even try to measure things that are more difficult to define and get people's and get people's answers on? And the answer is that networks just really, really matter in many settings across lower and middle income countries. We've seen over and over again that networks can matter for things like diffusing information. People use their networks to share risk with one another, especially when they have very volatile incomes. The social networks can affect things like the tech social networks can affect things like ideological polarization, how much people are agreeing with each other, how much conflict they're having with one another. And we're starting to see also that networks can be very relevant to things like job search and skill development too. I'll give you a really specific example from a study I've been running. So we recently surveyed almost 1,000 people, 1,000 entry-level workers in Johannesburg in South Africa. And we found that 58% of them got their jobs somehow through their network. So this is a context with a lot of network-based hiring. And so, of course, we want to start understanding, it's also a context with a lot of youth unemployment. And so, of course, we want to start understanding, well, who are people turning to? Who's got a good network? Who hasn't got a good network? Who are people turning to for advice and support? And how is that changing as we run our RCTs, as we use these programs? Understanding more about networks can help us understand how to design better programs. It helps us know who to target if we're trying to diffuse information to. It helps us understand maybe if we see that we're running something like a work experience program and people are not, speaking enough to their senior colleagues, for example, it helps us understand how can we maybe tweak that program in a way that would facilitate more of this interaction. Um, it also helps us to understand why maybe some people aren't benefiting as much from programs as others. So it could be a key source of heterogeneity in these kind of trials. And um, but although they're incredibly important to understand, they're also quite challenging to understand. And that's because a network is quite a rich object. It has lots of pieces to it. First of all, one of the key pieces is the people in it. So we're going to have different types of people, and we're going to have to think as researchers how to define who those people are, and who we're going to count and not count there. Each of these people has their own characteristics. So that might include things like their employment status, their gender, their all the same characteristics we think about capturing of our respondents, we might also now need to capture of some of their network members as well. There's also relationships going on in networks. Not everyone, understanding who knows whom and how much they know each other is another piece. So we might also again have to try and capture some of the characteristics of these relationships too. So here, maybe these people have this thicker line between them because they have a very strong relationship, whereas this is a weaker one. Maybe this is a professional relationship and this is a social one. There are different ways we might want to classify the relationships too. And so there's quite a lot going on here. And the typical structure of what we would call an ego network survey, which is thinking about this from the perspective of one person from our respondent, is we would start with a set of name generator questions. So we'd be asking them to literally generate a list of names, right? So we'd ask them questions like, who would you speak to about searching for when you're trying to search for a job, or who would you borrow and lend to if you're looking at those kind of networks, or who would you listen to, who's been influential on you around advice on vaccines, or whatever it is you're thinking about. You're going to define your network some way through a set of these questions. You're then going to ask, obviously, questions about the respondent as usual, but you're also going to have to ask some of these questions about their network members too. And finally, you're going to be also potentially asking some questions about the relationships between these people. So between the respondent and these other people. This is a lot to ask of a respondent. And of course, we don't need to know all of it. We don't need to know everyone they've ever heard of. But we do want to zero in on some of the key people in their life, some of the key people who are relevant to the research question you're looking at. And so even when we narrow down to some of these kind of key people, we've still got ourselves this kind of grid-like structure to our network survey. It's a little bit like when we do household rosters and we have to ask questions about every single person in the household. Now it's the same kind of thing where we're asking about every single person that you've listed in your name generator questions. And so we want to think about doing this carefully because this is going to take a lot of cognitive effort for our respondents. It's going to be hard for them to have to go through all of this in their mind and think about everything that's happening here. And we know from lots of other work that, we're often asking questions like this, even beyond social networks, where we're asking people to recall lots of information. And so we've learned a lot about how to do this now. We obviously, when we ask people questions about social networks, we're asking them to recall like a set of people, a set of characteristics of those people. They need to remember whether that person went to university or not, or whatever the surveyor is asking them. But we also do this in other areas. We ask people whether they were working 2 months ago. We asked them how much they were spending how much they've spent within the last month on a certain type of item, and they're having to sit there remembering it all and adding it up. We asked them when specific health events happen. So this kind of survey structure is quite typical of these studies, and it's a it's a lot for participants to do. And one of the things we've learned is that recall surveys, although they're essential because we can't be by people side by side all the time, and we have to rely on some of their memory, these surveys are not without their problems. We've seen when we've done survey experiments testing two different ways of answering a question that we sometimes get different answers. Maybe people get pulled towards a reference point. Maybe they are less good at remembering things that are further away from them. And one thing we're finding in studies of social networks is that unless we ask the question the right way, people might just fail to remember some of the people in their life, even though they're actually economically meaningful people to them. We might be extra concerned about this because we know that the kind of skills you need to answer a survey well, to deal with this cognitive load, are often connected to poverty itself. And so it could be that the people who have the lowest working memory, the lowest level of numeracy skills to be kind of counting among the people they're thinking of, or um, the people who might be most affected by who might find it most difficult to answer this question accurately, might be the very people we care about the most. They might be the people we think are, who are experiencing all kinds of sort of poverty related burdens, and actually they might be the people we most want to get the survey measure right for, and yet they're the people who are going to find this most difficult. This is something that kind of brings me over to sort of what we've learned so far about how to measure social networks better. But let me pause here and maybe just hear from the room whether there are any questions on what we've covered so far.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Uh, Hi. I'm Salamata. I'm joining from Nigeria. I was just wondering, at the last slide before this one that you were showing, you went over it quite fast. So I was hoping if you could maybe go back to that a little bit.
Yeah, okay, I can do that. Let me start sharing my screen again. If there are a couple of other questions, I can take those at the same time as well. Okay, let me share my screen and go back to the slide that I went over too quickly. Thank you for making me, thank you for prompting me to do this. Is this the slide you had in mind?
Yes, that's it.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so yeah, this is a really important set of research that's been, this is actually, none of this is my research, but I'm, relying on the work of others here. So there's been a lot of important research on the relationship between cognitive load or cognitive bandwidth and and poverty or scarcity of any sort. So that could be financial scarcity, it could be a scarcity of time because you have a lot of things going on in your life. Maybe you're trying to work two jobs and be a parent, and you might be time poor. Um, and one of the key findings here is that um, having these kind of burdens in your life, like having meaningful financial burdens, having meaningful time burdens, having to juggle lots of things, being uncertain about when you're next getting paid, it gives you a lot of different things you're having to kind of juggle in your mind and remember all the time. And so poverty and scarcity itself is already something that's taking up a lot of your mental capacity. And so when you're in this sort of when we're surveying, what this means for us is, I think, as researchers, when we're surveying a variety of people, some of them will have some of them might have more demanding lives than others, might have more scarcity than others. We might find that among our sample, some of the people we kind of most care about getting the right measures for. There will be maybe some of the poorest people. There'll be maybe some of the people with dependents or who have meaningful pressures and stuff in their life, might be the ones who are already under a lot of mental strain, and this causes them to answer questions differently. And so it might cause them to make a quicker, more what we call a more heuristic based sort of measure. So instead of sitting there really thinking and counting, through their network members, they might just give you a kind of quick answer because they just, they're sort of pushed to do that because they just simply don't have the working memory available. Likewise, people who have lower numeracy skills, again, they may be the people we most care about here. They're more likely to make kind of quick choices in response to a survey question, as opposed to more what we call more deliberative choices, where you're really thinking and reasoning through. I hope that helped clarify what was meant by this slide.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
I saw another hand up, so I'm happy to take another question. Prince, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. If you can hear me, thank
Yes.
you very much for taking time to explain these points. So, as a follow-up to what you just answered, how do we incentivize and sort of encourage, considering the cognitive load and the impact of that on the kinds of responses that may come from the most vulnerable? Do you have any recommended approach to sort of, encourage and incentivize responses in a way that can give a better reflection of what these people truly are experiencing, of course, considering all the contextual challenges?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and thank you for asking it because it really gets to the heart of the next part of the presentation. So I'm going to give you the quick answer, and then I'll spend the rest of the talk giving you the slow answer. The quick answer is that although we might ordinarily expect that asking the questions more step by step or more slowly is going to take more of these people's time and be worse, what we find when we try different approaches, asking the question in a sort of more bundled, quick way versus asking it more step by step, is that actually taking a bit longer on the survey to ask the questions a little bit more step by step, giving people longer time to respond and think, and guiding them through it, actually gets us that more sort of deliberative answer, where people are able to recall a large number of people. So that's my big takeaway, is that when we decompose our questions a bit more, and I'll be a bit more clear in the rest of the talk what I mean by that, that is going to reduce this kind of cognitive load we're putting on our participants. Any more questions? Okay.
We also have two questions that came through in the chat. So
Okay.
one from Chizimba, which says, which one is better, having a narrow set of responses or broad ones? Example of employment. So that's the first question. And then the second question in the chat from Alejandra is, how are the name lists created? How many observations are usually used or accepted? Is it possible to use technological tools to measure networks?
Okay, both excellent questions. I'm going to answer the first one now, and then I'm going to answer the second one, I hope, during the rest of the slides, because that's exactly what the rest of the talk's going to be around. So the first question was around which is better, going too narrow or going too broad, especially when considering that kind of question of how we define a job. Here I think unfortunately this isn't a situation where there's an easy, well, this way is better than that way. It's really something you have to, I hope what I was able to illustrate was that it can be dangerous to go too narrow and dangerous to go too broad. And actually, sometimes what we need is somewhere in the middle. But when it really depends on the context, if you are, I don't know, say you're working on evaluating through an RCT, an intervention that's just trying to get people, I don't know, off the street into any kind of job, then maybe you want to consider a very broad definition of a job. But if instead you're trying to, you're working on an RCT, trying to get people into where the program's designed to try and get people into maybe a better quality job or a job at a certain skill level, a job of a certain level of formality, then again, you want to tailor your outcome measures to the thing you're trying to evaluate. That's my advice. So it's not, and sadly, it's not one of those situations where I can recommend to you go narrow or go broad. One is better than the other. It's just really going to depend on the situation. My advice to you really is just to is to really spend time thinking about this and then to pilot your measures. Do not go from doing 0 surveys to hundreds of surveys for your RCT like this. You have to, test it out on 10 people, test it out on 50 people, maybe even run a little experiment like the one I'm about to show you, where you try different ways of asking the question and see what happens. That would be my advice. Okay. All right, I'm going to deal with the second question. Actually, it was going to be almost the whole rest of the talk. So I'll come to this question about how should we actually generate this sort of list of people. So let me tell you a bit about the context I've been working in and how we did this. So I was looking at I was looking at how networks affect things like hiring and information on labor market networks. And I'm working on this study in South Africa, in Johannesburg, which is a context that has extremely high rates of youth unemployment and extremely high rates of inequality. So these are two different neighborhoods. Anyone in Johannesburg knows exactly which ones these are. They're separated only by a highway, but as you can see, life is very different one side of the highway to each other, and people probably have quite different networks, and whether or not people from here know people from here or not is going to depend on lots of factors. What we wanted to understand in this population was a couple of very simple measures, or at least they seem simple to begin with. First of all, how many people does each of our respondents actually turn to sort of support them as they navigate the labor market? These are all quite young people in this high unemployment environment. And so we wanted to understand, how many people are they just talking to when they're trying to search for a job, trying to deal with a problem at work, that kind of thing. And then obviously we also want to understand what's the kind of quality of their network in terms of how informative it's going to be on these kind of labor market issues. So one way to think of quality is like, how many people are you turning to who actually have a formal job? Or how many of them might have tertiary education? So two different ideas. How many people do you know who have jobs? How many people do you know who are highly educated? And just thinking about these as maybe being like rough proxies of sort of network quality. So again, they might seem like sort of simple measures, but they would help us sort of understand the difference between, say, a respondent like this, who's got a big network, but not many people who are employed, versus someone like this, who's not maybe turning to as many people, but actually they have a very high share of formally employed people that they're turning to, versus someone like this who's got very few people they're listing, but they are having but almost none of them are employed. Maybe they're unemployed, and almost none of them are employed either. None of the network members are employed either. If you did want to take that step of asking questions of a network and then trying to understand the sort of global network structure of how the whole society is organized, this is also a type of question that gives you something called ARD, or aggregate relational data. And so I'm just pointing you to a couple of studies that will show you how to bridge that gap to get the overall network too. So yes, you would think that these are quite simple measures, and they could be useful measures to understand all kinds of things we want to understand in RCTs. They might be, if we're evaluating something like a mentoring program or a work experience program or something, we might want to look at whether this is expanding people's networks. And so these might be measures you use there. They also might be measures you use for other things in an RCT too. And so we'd like to get them right, but we're going to show you that when we ask these questions in two different ways, we're going to get two different answers. So let me explain to you how our experiment works. We asked roughly 400 of these people these questions in this format. We sort of first defined what we mean by a labor market network. So we sort of listed what our definition is there. It's people you turn to when you're searching for a job. It's people you turn to when you're having a problem at work, whatever. We came up with the list ourselves. We then asked respondents to sort of sit there listing the network members who met this criteria, and then to count among them and give us the sort of overall size and contacts who have this trait of being formally employed or having tertiary education. In our second treatment group, we did the same thing, but we gave them a sort of more visual approach and a more step-by-step method of eliciting the network members and their traits. And I'll show you the software we use to do that. So this is the more sort of status quo of kind of how people normally do this sort of thing. This is something that was using this sort of new software we were testing. And then finally, we because we wanted to be able to unpack if we saw any differences between these methods, why we saw them, we introduced another group, a smaller group, that was going to do something similar to what the visual method was doing, but in the sense that it was decomposing the question and going more step by step. But it was not using the visual software. So it was using just an enumerator asking a respondent these questions, but just doing it in this more step-by-step way. And so this is something that has a smaller sample size. It's just there. It's not the main test. The main comparison is these two, but it's there to help us understand the why we see any differences we see. Is it because of the visualization, or is it because of the step-by-step building of the network? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and just show you a little bit about what this software looks like. So this is the software. It's called Network Canvas, and I'm going to show you just with like a very simple 5-question survey, just to illustrate you the how it works. So you might first ask a question like this, like a name generator question that says, who would you speak to about your challenges at work? This is something an enumerator would hold this on their tablet and be working with the respondent, asking them this question. And let's say you answer and you say, let's say your respondent answers and says that they speak to Raquel. Sorry, Raquel, I'm not spelling your name correctly today. And they speak to Natalie, who's also on this call, and they also speak to their mother. Okay. Now you ask them, you can ask them a new name generator question. Sorry, just press too many buttons. now you can ask them another name generator question like, who would you speak to if you were applying for a job? And maybe here they again speak to Raquel and Natalie, but they don't speak to their mom because their mom's not so useful for that. Instead, they speak to their brother. Okay. So again, we can use, when we're using the software, we can use real names, we can use nicknames, we can try and identify people or not. It depends on the nature of what you're doing. If we were surveying on something very sensitive, like crime and violence indicators or something, I would probably encourage people to use nicknames or something to get that privacy. Once we have established the list of names, and we use 6 name generator questions, but you could use as many or as few as you felt was appropriate, you're then going to need to understand some characteristics about them and how you know them. So maybe I know Raquel and Natalie from work. My mom's obviously part of my family, and so is my brother. And so again, on a tablet, this works very smoothly. The respondent can swipe themselves or the numerator can do it. We can also ask questions about the person, like whether or not they have a job. So these 2 people have jobs. My mom's retired. My brother has a job. So you can start to see that I have quite a nice network that has lots of formally employed people in it. I can then ask questions about the relationships I have with these people. So I can ask, say, for example, a question like, do you feel comfortable asking this person for advice? So let's say I feel really comfortable with Raquel and maybe I don't feel very comfortable with Natalie, feel really comfortable with my mom and somewhat comfortable with my brother. And I might find that actually some of the people I feel most comfortable with are not necessarily the people who are most helpful to me. Or maybe I won't find that, we'll see. And so again, I can ask sort of a series of questions here. Maybe I wasn't so comfortable talking to Natalie, but actually Natalie is extremely helpful. Natalie is extremely helpful. So do talk to her if you have any questions. Whereas my mum, who I felt very comfortable with, is not someone who's so helpful to me. I can also use the software to try and understand who knows each other here. So here, for example, my Raquel and Natalie, who I both know through JPAL, know one another. Neither of them know my mom, but my mom knows my brother, of course. And so this is, like I said, this is just a few types of, this was just a short demo of the tool, just to show you a few types of questions that you can ask. But this was the idea of this visual step-by-step elicitation, is that you slowly build up who's in the network question by question, and then you have a very nice, easy visual way to classify them. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about where we sampled from. So we're sampling quite young people. They're typically right at the beginning of their careers. They have on average 5 months of work experience. Most of them are earning at the sort of towards the minimum wage end, or even less if they're not working full time. And we recruited them from different centres all over Johannesburg. One of the things we were worried about, because of the kind of cognitive loads that these kind of surveys can put on participants, especially if we're using the sort of traditional method that's not designed to break this down step by step and give them this sort of easy visuals to look at, was we were worried that this might impact how people processed or gave us the responses. And so one of the things we did here was we measured people's cognitive skills. We did this in a couple of different ways. The first way is that we measured something called their digit span. So this is where we give people a short task like, repeat these 3 numbers to me forwards and backwards, 4, 5, 2. And so the respondent has to remember what I just said, 4, 5, 2. It has to repeat the number back to me and then forwards and then backwards. And you step up the level of difficulty by stepping up the number of digits to see at what point they can't do it anymore. This is a tool that we use to capture something called numerical working memory. This is your ability to sort of hold and hold a series of things in your head and manipulate them. So meaning, count among them, do things with them, recite them forwards and backwards. And this is exactly what we're asking people to do when we conduct these kind of surveys on social networks. We're asking them to remember a bunch of people in their life, and then we're asking them to count among those people. How many of these people have formal jobs? How many of these people have tertiary education? That's the process, right? So this is exactly that's why we use this measure. We also just, for out of interest more, asked a few alternative measures. So we asked respondents to self-report on a 5-point scale, how easy they found it to answer the questions, how much effort was required, whether the questions made sense. And at the end of the survey, when the respondent had finished, we also asked the enumerator to rate the respondent's level of comprehension. We found in practice that only the digit span measure was sort of useful to us. It was the one that had real variation in it and had was maybe more capturing something to do with the process of remembering networks. Unfortunately, with these measures, almost everyone put themselves in the highest category, and so we had very little variation here. And so this is again a good lesson in why measurement is important. If we rely on self-reported measures for things like this, where we might end up capturing some sort of social biases towards trying to put yourself in the kind of highest category instead of the true underlying cognitive skills people have. And so this was our sort of more objective measure, worked better for this. Okay, I'm going to show you the results now, and the ones I want you to kind of focus on, or I'm going to include in most of the results, I'm just going to focus on those first two groups. And so I'm going to leave the auditory group to be the reference group, and I'm going to show you how much extra kind of how different compared to that auditory group, the network size and composition is when we use the visual method. I'm also going to report the kind of cognitive score and then this interaction between the two. And I'm going to control for a bunch of stuff, but I won't show you that today. So the first thing we find is that we get a roughly 50% larger network when we use the visual tool. So on average, people were giving us kind of 4 respondents, four people in response to those name generator questions. I had a question in the little break earlier about how many is typical. I hear from my colleagues in South Asia running the social network studies there that this is also fairly, this sort of 4 number is fairly typical there too. Obviously, it does depend on how many of those name generator questions you ask and the nature of the networks you're studying. But what we find is that when we use the step-by-step visual software, we get kind of an extra 2 people in the network. And so this is a sort of 50% larger network than before. The other thing we find really importantly is that this is especially true when I'm here going to add in the cognitive skills related variables one by one. And I find that actually when we think about the people with the lowest cognitive skills, so the people who get 0 on any of these are represented here. So the people who are getting 0 of these cognitive questions right, then we see really large differences between the different survey methods for these people who have the lowest cognitive skills. And for people who have slightly higher working memory, the difference is not so pronounced. So this is, they're less affected. People with higher working memory are less affected by the survey mode. They're less likely to sort of give you a different answer compared to the people with low working memory. I'm also going to find those were our results for network size. We also find meaningful differences in network composition. So when we think about those measures like the quality of your network, again, we find that actually people are a lot less likely to give you only their sort of high status contacts here. So only the contacts who are employed or the contacts who have tertiary education. We think that this is because, again, when we're using the auditory method, which is this more kind of bundled way of asking the question, it's a lot more cognitively costly to go through that kind of exercise, that people are just sort of zoning in on their high status contacts. So they're zoning in on the people who are more likely to be employed or more likely to be in tertiary education, and that's why we're seeing these kind of composition differences. Again, we find that potentially these differences are slightly offset for people who have higher working memory. This is a bit less precisely estimated, so not all these are statistically significant at 5% level, but again, it's sort of seems to be indicating that they're going in the opposite direction to the survey effect. So we're finding different answers when we ask the question in different ways. A key question is whether one of these measures is better or whether they're just different. I think this is a really hard question to answer. I think I'll show you one way we tried to look at this. So we thought to ourselves, well, if these were all people who were in a job and they got that job somehow way before we ever did this survey with them. And some of them will have got their job through their network. Some of them will not have got their job through their network. And so we thought maybe whether or not they got their job through their network should be kind of correlated with the measure of their network, if it's a good measure. And so what we did is we asked the person a very open-ended question, just how did you get this job? And we trained our enumerators to code their response into whether or not they got the job in a way that was network related or not. And when we look at which measure is sort of most predictive of this variable, we find at first glance, it seems like the auditory method is actually more predictive of this, because again, this is getting people to sort of zone in on those high status contacts, except that when we actually subset the visual method to only focusing on the people they said help them when they search for a job, we find the people who give us more contacts in relation to that question are also more likely to have got their job through their network. So this is sort of, I don't think it's strongly weighs in favor of one method or the other, but it shows you that if you take a sort of appropriately subsetted measure that you can do in the sort of visual method and is harder to do in an auditory method, you can get something that is predicting a real outcome here. The other thing I'll say on the sort of is one measure better or are they just different? Again, a bit like the, how big or small is the network meant to be? It's again one of those questions like the job one is we want it to be not too small, not too big, just right for what we're doing. And so again, this is something that kind of requires a lot of thought and input. Just quickly to wrap up on what we find about when we do look at that decomposing the question. So still losing the tool, just using the sort of standard enumerator asking a question in an auditory way, we find that this makes a big difference. So this again, we actually get closer to the visual method. We get closer to the visual method when we're breaking out the question step by step. And we seem again find that people with lower cognitive skills are more affected by the breaking down of the question. So this again weighs in favor of that answer I gave before, that maybe the best thing we can do is just take this slow and actually decompose the question bit by bit. So just to wrap up, I guess the key takeaways are that studying social networks is really important, but really difficult. It's difficult for you as a researcher because you have to think about, well, who am I going to focus on and which pieces of the network most matter to me? But it's also difficult for the respondent because of the substantial amount of recall they have to do. This is especially difficult, I find, for sort of respondents who might, I don't know, have to think about people from very different areas of their life. Maybe they're a migrant, maybe they're thinking about people back home and thinking about people close by, and they're having to remember, wait, did that person go to university or not? I'm not sure. And if we don't address this recall, these cognitive demands, we risk generating measures that have systematic recall biases and that are going to give us the wrong answer, especially for the people we care about the most. But there's something we can do. We can decompose the question to reduce the cognitive burden on our participants and make it less reliant on their working memory. And despite all of these difficulties, it's really worth persevering. I've been studying South African labor market for over a decade of my life, but running this network survey has shown me so many things that we just didn't know before. We're seeing working with a big nonprofit organization that runs a work experience program, and we're seeing so many important things that we weren't seeing before by being able to use the software and do this kind of work about how much we need to work hard at sort of stimulating more senior junior interaction in these settings, and how we need to work harder to make these programs more effective by approaching colleagues. We're also seeing really interesting things about women turning more to women and men turning more to men for support in the labour market. So we're maybe illuminating kind of whole new underexplored areas of the sort of labour market disparities we see by gender. I'm sure if you were to persevere and try and get through the management challenges and try and study the social networks on whatever the topics and contexts you're working on, I hope you will find similarly fascinating insights that help improve your work. And so that's all for me today. Thank you very much for listening. And yeah, happy to take any questions if there's time.
Thank you, Nilmini. There's one question in the chat that we can maybe take, and I see there's a couple of hands. So the one in the chat was, for researchers who have never collected social network data, what are the most common design mistakes when implementing ego network surveys, and how can they be avoided?
So amazing question. I think this is a really sort of new and flourishing area where we're learning actively all the time. And I think sometimes when we're studying something new and different like this, we're tempted to go and copy what someone else has done. And so it would be easy to go and copy, let's say, for example, you're studying labor market networks in Africa. It would be really easy to go and copy and paste some of the ways people have looked at borrowing and lending networks in South Asia. That's but actually and for sure there's been some amazing work done on that, and we should take inspiration. But when you think about your context, your topic, it might be that actually the way we have to ask the question needs to be slightly tweaked or different. So I would say the most important thing is to sort of definitely take inspiration from other studies, but really think about your own context and definitely just try things out. Raquel and I learned a lot by trying this survey on ourselves, on each other, on our friends and family, before then maybe trying it on 10 participants, 20 participants. And we slowly built up before we got to the point of surveying 1,000 participants like we did in this study. So really, I think piloting is critical here. Do we want to take any more, Raquel? There's a couple of hands up.
It's up to you. We can maybe take one or two more.
Yeah.
And
Very
then
happy for those of you who need to go. I know we're a little bit over time, so thank you for joining. And then very happy to stay on for a few minutes and take, I think we've got Salamatu Abdul Rahman. would you like to ask your question? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nilmini, for the great presentation. I think it brought a lot of insights to what we are currently doing where I work at Busara. I was just wondering what you think the benefit of qualitative method would add to social network analysis, because that's what we're currently doing. We used a qualitative approach that asks like certain kind of questions, and now we're doing like data stripping and more inductive coding that somehow we want to feed back into like a more quantitative form based on like some of the codes that we get from our qualitative analysis, and then feed them back into like a map that we're developing. But the context is more on civic engagement. So we're trying to understand how people receive information and how they act on that information in terms of like engaging with civic issues, or even trying to understand what they need to do as citizens in their communities. So I was wondering if you, in your research, if you guys used any qualitative method, and how, in what approach, or at what point did you guys use it? And then my second question, just to add, is just around policy. So how are you guys translating the analysis? What's the outcome in terms of having impact on how we know government is supposed to design policy around, particularly for the labor project that you're working on, labor market project you're working on? How does the research translate into policy making? What's the benefit of doing social network analysis, aside from improving an intervention, but how does it impact policy making within the sector?
Right. Okay. So both excellent questions. Let me answer them quickly, and then I'll take Abu Bakar's question. Yeah, on your first question. So yeah, I absolutely support the idea of you doing a lot of qualitative work just to understand, on your topic, I think, where people are getting the information from, who they have influence over, if they were to do any sort of civic engagement themselves, who would they be focusing that on? Who do they feel empowered to sort of engage with and influence and stuff? And so I think that would be a really natural starting point. We also did some of this ourselves, right, Raquel? We ran focus groups over years. We had I've been doing labor market surveys we've been studying South African labor markets for over a decade, so done lots of work in the past. But in preparation for this study, we also ran some qualitative work of our own just to try and understand how people were kind of navigating the workplace, which was our focus. In terms of policy outcomes, so we actually rolled this little survey experiment into the pilot data collection we're doing towards a bigger study. So our bigger study is focusing on how we can potentially improve the efficacy of work experience programs in the country. So we have lots of programs where we're trying to take people from kind of disadvantaged communities, put them into formal workplaces, and we're looking at kind of whether there are ways we can support people as they go into these communities, as they go into these experiences better. So this feeds into sort of there's a lot of national policy focus in South Africa around things like affirmative action, or work experience programs, vocational training programs and stuff. And so it's all feeding into our wider work, is going to feed into the design. And what we did here was, since we were collecting data to pilot data for that wider project, where we'll be running the series of RCTs informing those policy decisions, we thought, why not just, since we're collecting the data anyway, why not just randomize how we're asking the question and see if we can learn something methodological too. Then we get to support both, we get to further our policy outcome, we get to further our policy work as well as our research methods work at the same time. You get 2 papers for the price of 1, I guess. Okay. Abu Bakar.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, super. Thanks for the good presentation.
Thanks.
I had only one question, which is very short. My question was with regard to mobile phone data. Can we use that one as like a proxy for in terms of the number of people that you talk, the how frequently you talk to some people, how you don't talk to others, the longevity of the calls that you make to some people, and all those stuff to kind of like measure social network.
Yeah, so if you can get your hands on that kind of data, it can be an amazing source and a much cheaper, less cognitively demanding way to collect data on social networks of a lot of people. And it will capture some of the things you care about. It will obviously capture just who people are speaking to and how long those calls take. I guess what it won't be able to necessarily capture is you know, it might only be a proxy for sort of, I don't know, who they trust the most or who's most influential in their lives or that kind of thing. So it might be a reasonable proxy, it might not be a reasonable proxy depending on the topic you're concerned with. But certainly a much cheaper way to get this kind of data for a lot of people. And I think that question about whether or not it's a good proxy or not for the things you need to know about people's networks, you might want to just do a little bit of testing, little bit of qualitative work or something to just sort of check your assumptions. So let's say you've got your mobile phone data for some people, you get a few of them into a room or call a few of them to just actually ask some real questions too and see if that sort of measures up to what you're seeing in the administrative data. That would be one way to maybe approach. Just check yourself on whether that data is useful for you. But yeah, it's certainly an amazing source of data. Same with mobile payment data can be quite useful for this sort of thing. Check social network data if you can get your hands on it, would be great. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
All right. Okay. I think
Yeah.
that's a wrap.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't think we have time for more questions, but thank you so much, Nilmini, for the insightful presentation. I think we'll all be designing better surveys in the future. And I will be sharing a recording of this webinar with everyone who registered for the webinar, and I'll also be uploading it to our website in the next couple of weeks. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and Nilmini for the amazing presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me.